Keanu Reeves sacrifices his life to save homeless man from car crash. The streets of Los Angeles were quieter than usual. The neon lights from distant billboards flickered across the pavement, their glow reflecting off puddles left behind by a rare evening drizzle. Keanu Reeves walked alone, his hands tucked into the pockets of his black jacket, his head slightly lowered. He had just finished a late-night talk show appearance, something he never truly enjoyed but did out of respect for the fans. It was always the same questions. His upcoming projects, his love for motorcycles, and the never-ending praise for his kindness. He appreciated it, but tonight, he wanted silence. Taking a shortcut through a dimly lit alley, he exhaled deeply. The world always saw him as Keanu Reeves, the action star, the legend, the humble icon. But here, alone in the quiet of the city, he was just a man walking home. Then he saw him. A homeless man, hunched over on the sidewalk near the entrance of a 24-hour convenience store. His clothes were ragged, his beard unkempt, and his belongings, a small bundle of tattered bags, were scattered across the wet pavement. The man, maybe in his 60s, struggled to gather them as the wind kicked up, blowing some of his possessions into the gutter. People walked past him without a second glance. A couple crossed the street to avoid him. Someone from the store peered out, frowning, as if debating whether to tell him to move along. Keanu stopped walking. Something about the scene bothered him. He watched as the old man fumbled with shaking hands, trying to pick up a few damp dollar bills that had fallen from his pocket. Keanu sighed. He didn't have to get involved. He didn't have to stop. But he did. "Hey man," Keanu said softly, crouching down beside him. "Need a hand?" The old man's head snapped up, his eyes filled with a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. I got it," he muttered, but his frail fingers betrayed him, struggling to grasp the money before the wind took it further down the sidewalk. Keanu reached out and gently pressed his palm over the bills, keeping them in place. "Here," he said, picking them up and handing them back. The man hesitated before taking them. His fingers were ice cold. "Thank you," he whispered. Keanu nodded, gathering the rest of the man's scattered belongings. A few small personal items, a lighter, an old photograph, a small notebook with pages worn thin from use. He placed them carefully back into the man's bag. "What's your name?" Keanu asked. The man hesitated. "Elliot." Keanu smiled. "Nice to meet you, Elliot." The old man glanced at him again, his expression shifting as if suddenly recognizing who was crouched beside him. Keanu shook his head, smiling. "Doesn't matter. Just a guy helping another guy." Elliot blinked, his lips pressing together. It had been a long time since someone treated him like a person. Keanu reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He didn't believe in just throwing money at people's problems, but something about Elliot told him this man needed a break. He took out a few crisp $100 bills, folded them, and placed them in Elliot's hand. Elliot's eyes widened. I can't take this," he stammered. Keanu smiled. "Sure you can." Elliot's fingers curled around the money, his hands shaking. "Why are you doing this?" Keanu shrugged. "Because I can." And then, tires screeched in the distance. Keanu's head snapped toward the intersection at the end of the block. A black sedan sped through a red light, moving way too fast for a city street. The engine roared as it tore down the road, swerving slightly as if the driver had lost control. Keanu's muscles tensed. Something was wrong. The sedan barreled forward, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It veered toward the curb, its tires skidding against the wet pavement. And Elliot, still crouched on the sidewalk, didn't see it coming. Keanu's breath hitched. The world slowed down. He moved. Without thinking, without hesitating, he lunged toward Elliot, grabbing the old man's coat and yanking him backward. Elliot let out a strangled gasp as Keanu threw him aside, sending him tumbling onto the pavement. And in that instant, the car slammed into Keanu Reeves. The force sent him flying backward. Glass shattered. Metal crumpled. The world became a blur of sound and motion. Keanu's body crashed through the storefront window behind him, the impact sending shards of glass spraying in every direction. A sickening crunch echoed through the night. Then, silence. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The world stood still, And then, screams. Someone shouted, "Oh my God!" Elliot scrambled to his hands and knees, his breath coming in short gasps. His eyes darted toward the wreckage, toward Keanu, who lay motionless amid the shattered glass. The black sedan's driver stumbled out, his face pale as a ghost. He was in his mid-20s, his hands trembling, his phone still clutched in his fingers. He had been texting while driving. He took one look at the scene, the broken window, the crowd forming, the blood on the pavement, and ran. Elliot's pulse pounded in his ears as he crawled toward Keanu. No, 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 no. He reached him, his shaking hands hovering just over Keanu's chest. There was so much blood. "Somebody call 911, a bystander screamed. Elliot's throat tightened. Keanu's eyes fluttered open, barely. His breathing was shallow, uneven. His lips curled into a weak, almost amused smile. "Kid," Keanu whispered. "Haven't been called that in a long time." Elliot let out a broken laugh, gripping his jacket. "Stay with me, man. Just stay with me." Keanu's gaze flickered toward the sky. His chest rose and fell unevenly. "Did I?" He coughed, his voice barely audible. "Did I get you out of the way?" Elliot's eyes burned. "Yeah, man. You did. You saved me." Keanu exhaled, slow and soft. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." His fingers twitched slightly, reaching toward Elliot's hand. And then his grip went slack. Elliot felt it happen. Felt the moment Keanu Reeves stopped breathing. "No, no, no, no. Somebody help him." The siren screamed in the distance. Elliot pressed his forehead against Keanu's chest, gripping the fabric of his jacket, sobbing. And as the world began to gather, as the news cameras arrived, as the name Keanu Reeves trended globally, a legend had fallen. The sound of sirens filled the night, their wailing growing louder as flashing red and blue lights illuminated the shattered storefront. Paramedics rushed forward, pushing through the stunned onlookers who had gathered around the scene. The air smelled of burnt rubber, gasoline, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Elliot refused to let go of Keanu's jacket. His hands trembled as he clutched the fabric, his knuckles turning white. "Come on, man. Wake up. Please." The paramedics moved fast, their voices sharp and efficient. "We need a pulse. Possible blunt force trauma to the chest. Get the defibrillator ready." "Sir, step it. Let us work." But Elliot couldn't move. His body felt frozen, his mind refusing to accept what had just happened. Just minutes ago, he had been a nobody, sitting on the cold pavement, invisible to the world. And then, Keanu Reeves had stepped into his life. And now, he was watching him die. A paramedic placed 2 fingers on Keanu's neck, feeling for a pulse. "Weak pulse. He's still with us, barely." Elliot gasped. "He's still alive." The paramedics worked furiously, cutting open Keanu's shirt to assess the damage. Bruising had already begun to spread across his chest where the car had struck him. Glass shards clung to his arms, and a gash on his forehead bled steadily, dark red against his pale skin. "Sir, we need to move him now," one of the paramedics said, addressing Elliot. Elliot hesitated. He didn't want to let go. Then, with a shaky breath, he whispered, "Save him." The paramedics carefully lifted Keanu onto the stretcher, strapping him down. Elliot scrambled to his feet, his legs unsteady, and followed them to the waiting ambulance. The crowd had doubled. People held up their phones, recording every second. Some whispered in shock, others just stood there, frozen in disbelief. Elliot caught fragments of their conversations. "Is that really Keanu Reeves? No way, what happened? I think he saved that guy. Dude, check Twitter, he's already trending. Hashtag pray for Keanu. Hashtag Keanu the hero. Hashtag thank you Keanu." Elliot swallowed the lump in his throat as the doors to the ambulance swung shut. The last thing he saw before they sped away was a group of people bowing their heads, whispering prayers for a man they had never met, but who had given them so much. Keanu's breathing was shallow, his chest barely rising under the oxygen mask. The heart monitor beeped at an irregular rhythm, each sound a fragile promise that he was still here. Elliot sat against the wall of the ambulance, gripping the edge of his seat so tightly that his fingernails dug into the fabric. He couldn't tear his eyes away from Keanu's face. So calm, so still. A paramedic adjusted and drip, his voice calm but urgent. BP dropping. He's losing a lot of blood. Elliot clenched his fists. Do something. The paramedic didn't even flinch. We're doing everything we can. Just talk to him. Keep him here. Elliot swallowed hard, leaning forward. Hey man, listen to me. You gotta fight, okay? You saved my life, but I need you to save yourself now. You hear me? Keanu didn't respond. Elliot's voice cracked. Damn it, don't do this. Don't leave. Not like this. For the first time in years, Elliot felt something stir inside him. Guilt. Why had it been him that Keanu saved? Why was he still breathing while the man who had given the world so much was barely holding on? The weight of it crushed him. Then, Keanu stirred. It was small, barely noticeable, but Elliot saw it. His fingers twitched slightly, his eyelids fluttering. The paramedic noticed too. He's responsive. Elliot leaned in closer. Hey man, can you hear me? Keanu's lips parted slightly. His voice was barely above a whisper. Yeah. Elliot exhaled sharply, his chest tightening with relief. You scared the hell out of me, man. Keanu's lips twitched just slightly. Sorry about that. Elliot let out a weak chuckle, his eyes burning. You ever think about putting yourself first for once? Keanu blinked, his gaze unfocused. Not really my thing. Elliot swallowed the lump in his throat. Yeah. I figured. The heart monitor beeped steadily, but Keanu's eyes were growing heavier. The paramedic beside him noticed and quickly injected something into his fore. Stay with us, Mr. Reeves. Keanu's lips moved again, but this time, it wasn't just a whisper. Make it count. Elliot's breath hitched. What? Keanu's gaze finally met his. Make it count, Elliot. Elliot froze. How did he even remember his name? But before he could ask, Keanu's eyes slipped shut again. The heart monitor's beeping slowed. The paramedics moved faster. We're losing him. Elliot pressed himself against the wall of the ambulance, his body numb, as they worked desperately to keep Keanu alive. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors were already waiting. As Keanu was wheeled inside, Elliot tried to follow, but a nurse stopped him at the door. Sir, you can't go in there. Elliot's hands shook. Please. He saved my life. The nurse hesitated. She had seen the news, understood what had just happened, but hospital protocol was strict. Finally, she gave him a sympathetic nod. Wait here. We'll do everything we can. Elliot slumped into one of the chairs in the waiting room, his hands gripping his knees. The world outside was losing its mind. The news had already spread like wildfire. Every major outlet was covering the accident. Fans had gathered outside the hospital, holding candles, leaving notes and flowers. Millions of people were waiting, praying for a miracle. And so was Elliot. He had lost so much in his life. Friends, family. But losing Keanu Reeves, ***, a man who had shown him kindness when the world ignored him, ***, felt like something deeper. Like losing a light that the world desperately needed. His hands trembled as he whispered, please. Just let him live. Hours passed. The hospital was silent except for the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights. Elliot had barely moved, his eyes locked on the double doors leading to the emergency room. Then finally, a doctor stepped out. Elliot shot to his feet. The doctor removed his mask, exhaling. He's stable. Elliot felt his knees almost give out. He's alive. The doctor nodded. He has a long recovery ahead, but yes, he's alive. Elliot ran a shaking hand through his hair. Thank God. The doctor hesitated. He was asking for you. Elliot blinked. Me? The doctor nodded. Yeah. Said he had something to tell you. Elliot's heart pounded. As he stepped through the hospital doors, the world outside erupted in celebration. Keanu Reeves was still here, and Elliot had a feeling his life was never going to be the same again. Elliot's heart pounded as he followed the doctor down the brightly lit hospital hallway. His worn-out shoes squeaked against the polished linoleum floor, his breath shallow. He couldn't believe Keanu was still alive. He had been sure the man had taken his last breath in that ambulance. That those final words, make it count, had been goodbye. And yet, against all odds, he had survived. The doctor stopped in front of a hospital room, placing a hand on the door. He's still weak, so don't push him to talk too much. But he insisted on seeing you. Elliot swallowed hard and nodded. The door swung open and there he was. Keanu Reeves lay in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped steadily. His face was bruised, a fresh bandage on his forehead. His right arm was immobilized, likely from a fractured rib or shoulder injury, and in 4 dripped fluid into his vein. Yet, despite everything, he managed a faint smile when he saw Elliot. "Hey kid." Elliot let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Hey man, you scared the hell out of me." Keanu gave a weak chuckle. "Yeah, I have that effect on people." Elliot moved cautiously toward the chair beside the bed, sitting down. He didn't know what to say. The emotions were still too raw, too overwhelming. So instead, he just stared at Keanu, the man who had almost died for him. Keanu studied him for a moment before sighing. "You okay?" Elliot let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Dude, you're the one who got hit by a damn car. Shouldn't I be asking you that?" Keanu smirked. "Guess we're both a little messed up, huh?" Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only came after something life-changing. Finally, Elliot found his voice. "Why?" Keanu's brow furrowed. "Why what?" Elliot swallowed the lump in his throat. "Why did you save me?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Because you were in danger." Elliot shook his head. "That's not an answer. You don't even know me. I'm just some homeless guy on the street. You could have walked away. You could have let me get hit." Keanu's expression softened. His eyes held something deeper, something that Elliot couldn't quite name. "Because no one else was going to." Elliot blinked. Keanu exhaled slowly. "I know what it's like to feel invisible. To feel like the world has decided you don't matter." He turned his gaze toward the ceiling. "No one deserves that." Elliot felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected those words, hadn't expected someone like Keanu Reeves to understand what it felt like to be forgotten. Elliot clenched his fists. "Well, you almost died because of me. And now the whole world's losing their minds." Keanu gave him a knowing smile. "Yeah, that tends to happen when I do something stupid." Elliot huffed a breath of laughter. Understatement of the year. Keanu's smile faded slightly. "But it was worth it." Elliot frowned. "How the hell was it worth it?" "You're in a hospital bed because of me." Keanu's eyes locked onto his. "Because you're still here." Elliot couldn't look away. It wasn't just a statement. It was a challenge. Keanu had risked everything for a man he didn't even know. And now, Elliot had to decide if he was going to waste that second chance. Before he could say anything, the door suddenly burst open. A wave of noise flooded into the room as Keanu's agent, publicist, and several hospital staff rushed inside. Elliot immediately stepped back, watching as people swarmed Keanu's bedside. "Mr. Reeves, thank God you're awake." The press is outside, CNN, BBC, every major outlet. The world is waiting for a statement. Keanu sighed heavily. "Of course they are." His agent, a well-dressed man in his 50s, rubbed his temples. "Keanu, listen to me. You have no idea how massive this has become. The entire internet is talking about you. There are vigils outside. People are calling you a real-life superhero." Keanu's expression remained unreadable. "I'm not a superhero." The publicist interjected. "That's not the point. This is the biggest media moment of your career. We need to craft the right message." Keanu finally looked annoyed. "I'm not crafting anything." His agent hesitated. "Keanu, if we handle this right, you could change the narrative forever. We're talking about humanitarian awards, endorsements, hell, even political influence." Keanu's jaw tightened. And then he did something none of them expected. He turned his head toward Elliot. "What do you think?" Silence. Elliot froze. "Me?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah. What should I do?" The room fell deathly quiet. Keanu Reeves, the biggest movie star on the planet, was asking a homeless man for advice. Elliot swallowed hard. He wasn't used to his opinion mattering. But now he did. He looked at the people surrounding Keanu. The publicists, the doctors, the executives. They all saw a brand to manage, a moment to capitalize on. But Keanu? He just saw people. Elliot took a deep breath. You want to know what I think? Keanu nodded. Elliot's grip tightened on his jacket. Don't make this about you. Make it about what you did. The agent scoffed. That's the same thing. Elliot shook his head. No, it's not. If you go out there and just talk about yourself, people are going to treat this like another celebrity moment. But if you, he hesitated, gathering his thoughts. If you talk about the people no one sees, the ones like me, the ones who don't get second chances, he met Keanu's eyes. Then maybe your story actually means something. Keanu stared at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. An hour later, Keanu Reeves stepped out of the hospital, flanked by security and cameras. Thousands of people had gathered outside. Fans, reporters, even celebrities, all waiting for a statement. Keanu walked slowly, carefully, still recovering from his injuries. Elliot stood just behind him, heart racing. Keanu took the microphone. The world held its breath. He spoke simply. I shouldn't be here. Silence. I should be dead. But I'm not. Because sometimes, life gives you second chances. The crowd listened, hanging on to his every word. This isn't about me. This is about the people we ignore every single day. People like Elliot. Keanu gestured behind him, and Elliot felt every eye turn toward him. If I could do one thing with this moment, it would be this. Don't wait until it's too late to care about someone. The world went silent. And then, the applause started. Not just polite applause. Thunderous, deafening applause. Elliot felt a lump rise in his throat as Keanu turned to him and smiled. He had saved Elliot's life. And now, Elliot was going to make it count. The roar of applause filled the streets, echoing off the hospital walls. People weren't just cheering, they were moved. You could feel it in the way they clapped, in the way their eyes shined, in the stunned silence that had come just before. Keanu hadn't made this about himself. He had turned the entire world's attention onto a problem no one wanted to see. Elliot felt it in his chest, a strange, unfamiliar warmth. For the first time in years, he felt like he mattered. Keanu turned slightly, eyes meeting his. He didn't need to say anything. The look said it all. This is your moment now. What are you going to do with it? Elliot swallowed hard, stepping forward before his nerves could stop him. His hands trembled slightly as he took the microphone Keanu handed him. The applause faded into quiet murmurs. No one expected him to speak. Hell, he wasn't sure he could. His throat felt tight, his pulse pounding in his ears. But then he looked out over the crowd. The cameras, the flashing lights, the thousands of eyes staring at him. They weren't just waiting. They were listening. And for the first time in his life, Elliot felt like his voice might actually mean something. He took a deep breath. I was invisible before tonight. The crowd went silent. People walked past me every day like I wasn't even there. Like I didn't exist. Like I wasn't worth stopping for. His voice was rough, hoarse, but steady. And if Keanu hadn't stopped, I wouldn't be standing here right now. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Someone in the crowd wiped a tear from their eye. Elliot's grip on the mic tightened. I don't know why he did it. I don't know why he thought I was worth saving. But he did. And now, I have to prove that he was right. A lump formed in his throat. I don't know what's next for me. But I know I'm not going back to the way things were. I can't. Keanu nodded, his face unreadable but proud. Elliot let out a small, shaky laugh. Guess I gotta make it count, huh? That was it. That was all he said. But when he stepped back, when Keanu gave him a firm squeeze on the shoulder, the crowd erupted. They weren't just cheering for Keanu anymore. They were cheering for Elliot. The next few days were a whirlwind. Elliot's life had changed overnight. One moment, he had been just another man on the streets, forgotten by the world. But now he was a symbol. The media latched onto his story just as fiercely as they had Keanu's. But this wasn't just about a celebrity's heroic act. It was about something deeper, something bigger. The headlines started pouring in. Keanu Reeves saves homeless man and changes his life forever. From the streets to the spotlight, the man who inspired Keanu. A second chance, Elliot's journey from homelessness to hope. But the most surprising thing? People cared. Not just about Elliot, but about the homeless crisis as a whole. For the first time, people saw it. Donations to homeless shelters skyrocketed. Awareness campaigns were launched. Politicians started talking about real change. And at the center of it all? Elliot. Elliot sat on a park bench, staring down at his hands. It had been 2 weeks since the accident. 2 weeks since Keanu Reeves had almost died for him. And now, for the first time in years, he wasn't sleeping under a bridge or huddled against a dumpster for warmth. He had a place to stay. Not just a shelter, an actual apartment. Not because someone handed it to him. Because he had earned it. After that press conference, people had reached out. Organizations had offered him help, real help. Job training, therapy, stability. And Keanu? Keanu made sure he had every opportunity to start over. But Elliot knew one thing for sure. This wasn't about a handout. This was about a second chance. And he wasn't going to waste it. There was a knock at his door. Elliot frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened it, his breath caught. Keanu. He was still a little banged up, bruises fading, his arms still in a sling, but he was smiling. Figured I'd check in, Keanu said, stepping inside. You know, make sure you haven't run off to become a Hollywood star without me. Elliot let out a breathy laugh. Yeah, I think I'll leave the movie thing to you. Keanu smirked. Good choice. Elliot motioned to the couch. Sit. You're still recovering, man. Keanu raised an eyebrow. You ordering me around now? Elliot shrugged. Guess I learned from the best. Keanu chuckled and sat down, looking around. The apartment was small but clean, cozy. A fresh start. He nodded approvingly. Looks good on you. Elliot scratched the back of his head. Still getting used to it. Keanu studied him for a moment. You doing okay? Elliot exhaled, leaning against the counter. Better than I have in a long time. Keanu nodded. Good. Silence stretched between them. Then Keanu tilted his head. So, what's next? Elliot frowned. What do you mean? Keanu gestured around. You got your second chance. What are you gonna do with it? Elliot hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. Surviving had been his only goal for years. But now he actually had a future to think about. And that was terrifying. Keanu must have seen the uncertainty on his face because he leaned forward slightly. You don't have to have all the answers right now. But promise me something? Elliot swallowed. Yeah. Don't waste it. Elliot let those words sink in. Then, slowly he nodded. I won't. Keanu grinned. Good. 'Cause I'd hate to have almost died for nothing. Elliot laughed. No pressure, right? Keanu winked. None at all. For the first time in a long time, Elliot didn't feel like a burden. He didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a man with a purpose. Because of one decision. Because of one act of kindness. Because someone had seen him when no one else did. And now, he was ready to see himself too. The community center was packed. Elliot adjusted his tie, a real tie, something he never thought he'd own, as he stood behind the podium, staring out at the sea of faces before him. People from all walks of life. Some wealthy, some struggling. Some who had once been where he was. And they were all here because of him. Because today was the grand opening of the Keanu Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to helping the homeless rebuild their lives. Elliot stepped up to the microphone, taking a deep breath. And then he smiled. A year ago, I didn't think I'd live to see another week. The audience listened, hanging on to his words. And now, I get to help other people live. Because one man believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. He turned slightly, meeting Keanu's gaze in the front row. Keanu gave him a small, knowing nod. Elliot's voice was steady. So I'm making it count? The applause shook the room. And for the first time, Elliot knew. This was just the beginning. Elliot stood by the glass window of the newly opened Keanu Foundation headquarters, gazing out at the city skyline. A year ago, he had been invisible. Now, people knew his name, not because of some miracle, but because he had earned it. The sound of chatter filled the air behind him. The grand opening event was in full swing. Politicians, business leaders, and activists had gathered to celebrate the launch of something that could change lives. And all of it had started with one man, Keanu. Elliot turned back toward the event space, his fingers tightening around the speech in his hand. It still didn't feel real. Just a year ago, he had been cold, starving, and hopeless. Now, he was about to stand in front of the world and prove that Keanu's sacrifice had mattered. Keanu wasn't one for grand entrances. He had been reluctant to come to the event at all, worried that it would feel too self-congratulatory. But when his car pulled up behind the building, away from the flashing lights and cameras, he knew he had to be here. The foundation wasn't just about Elliot. It wasn't just about him. It was about every single person who had been given up on. Stepping out of the car, Keanu adjusted his coat. The air was crisp cool. His ribs still ached sometimes, a lingering reminder of the accident. But the pain was a small price to pay for what had come out of it. As he entered the back hallway leading to the event space, he was met by one of Elliot's closest volunteers, a young woman named Maya. Her eyes widened. "Mr. Reeves, you're here." Keanu smiled. "Just Keanu." Maya grinned. "Elliot's speech is about to start. He doesn't know you're here yet?" Keanu's smirk deepened. "Let's keep it that way for now." Elliot exhaled, stepping up to the podium as the room fell silent. He glanced down at the speech in his hands. He had spent weeks writing it, rewriting it, making sure it was perfect. But now, standing here, staring at the faces of people who believed in this mission, he realized something. This speech, it wasn't his. It belonged to all of them. He put the paper down. And then he spoke from the heart. "A year ago, I was sleeping on the streets. I was starving. I was alone. I thought my life was over." The audience was silent, listening intently. And then one person saw me. Just one. And because he did, I got a second chance. His eyes scanned the room. He knew Keanu wasn't in the crowd, or so he thought. Keanu Reeves didn't just save my life. He gave me a reason to live it. A murmur rippled through the audience. "But this isn't about me. This isn't about him. This is about the people we walk past every single day and pretend not to see." His hands gripped the podium tighter. "I was lucky, but not everyone is. And that's why this foundation exists, because second chances shouldn't be a privilege. They should be a right." The room erupted into applause. And then, a familiar voice called out from the back. "That was a damn good speech." Elliot froze. He turned, and there, standing near the entrance, a relaxed smile on his face, was Keanu. The crowd gasped, turning to see him. Cameras flashed. The moment was suddenly 10 times bigger. Elliot blinked. "You came?" Keanu grinned. "Wouldn't miss it." Elliot chuckled, shaking his head. "Of course you'd show up like a ghost in the back of the room." Keanu laughed, stepping forward as the audience parted for him. He walked straight up to the stage and took the extra mic. "Look, I'm not a public speaker." The audience laughed at the irony. "But Elliot's right. This isn't about me. It's about how we treat each other. It's about seeing the people we ignore every day. And if my one stupid decision," he glanced at Elliot, smirking, "can start something like this, then maybe we should all be making stupid decisions more often." The room cheered. Keanu turned to Elliot, lowering the mic. "I'm proud of you, man." Elliot swallowed hard, trying not to get emotional. "Couldn't have done it without you." Keanu shook his head. "Yeah, you could have. You just needed someone to remind you." Elliot smirked. "Guess I gotta keep making it count, huh?" Keanu clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Damn right you do." The applause swelled again. And in that moment, Elliot knew his life had truly begun. The Keanu Foundation wasn't just another nonprofit. It became a movement. More cities started funding projects to help the homeless. Programs for job training, mental health care, and transitional housing started popping up nationwide. And everywhere Elliot went, people recognized him. One day, after visiting a new shelter opening in Chicago, Elliot walked down a busy street when a young man, maybe in his early 20s, stopped him. "Hey, are you Elliot? The guy Keanu saved?" Elliot smiled. "Yeah, that's me." The kid shifted nervously. I was homeless too. A few months ago. But I saw your speech. I saw what you did. And It made me realize I could change things too. Elliot's chest tightened. Man, that's amazing. What are you doing now? The kid grinned. I'm training to be a counselor. I want to help people get back on their feet. Like you did. Elliot couldn't stop the smile that spread across his face. This was why it all mattered. He reached out, shaking the kid's hand. You already are, man. Keep going. A year and a half after the accident, Elliot was back in Los Angeles, overseeing a new project when his phone buzzed. A simple text. Keanu, coffee? Elliot chuckled. Of course. They met in a small, tucked-away cafe. No cameras, no press. Just two guys having coffee. Keanu leaned back in his chair, smirking. So, Elliot, still making it count? Elliot laughed. Every damn day. Keanu raised his cup. That's what I like to hear. They clinked their mugs together. And in that moment, Elliot realized, it had never been about being saved. It had been about learning how to save himself. And because of one man's act of kindness, he would spend the rest of his life making sure others got the same chance. Elliot took a slow sip of his coffee, feeling the warmth spread through him. He still wasn't used to moments like this, just sitting in a cafe, having a normal conversation, like his life hadn't completely changed in the past year. He set the cup down, looking across the table at Keanu, who seemed just as relaxed as ever. It was strange how the man carried himself. After everything that had happened, the accident, the foundation, the speeches, Keanu still acted like none of it had been a big deal. Like he hadn't almost died pulling Elliot out of the way of that car. You really don't think about it, do you? Elliot asked, leaning back in his chair. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Think about what? The fact that you almost died. Keanu smirked slightly, swirling his coffee. What's the point? I didn't. Elliot exhaled sharply. You say that like it was a minor inconvenience. Keanu studied him for a moment before setting his cup down. I don't see the point in dwelling on things that already happened. I made a choice. I'd do it again. End of story. Elliot shook his head. I don't get you, man. Keanu smiled. That's probably a good thing. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the distant hum of the city filtering in through the cafe windows. Elliot still wasn't sure how he had ended up here, sitting across from a man who had changed his entire life. It was surreal, and sometimes he still felt like he was waiting for someone to wake him up and tell him it had all been a dream. But it wasn't. Keanu took another sip of his coffee before glancing out the window. So what's next for you? Elliot frowned slightly. What do you mean? Keanu turned back to him. You've done a lot this past year. The foundation's growing. You've helped a lot of people. But I can tell, you're still figuring things out. Elliot hesitated, fingers drumming against the table. I don't know. It's weird. I spent so much time just trying to survive. Now, I have options and I don't even know where to start. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. That's a good problem to have. Yeah, but it's still a problem. Keanu smirked. Then solve it? Elliot let out a short laugh. You make it sound so easy. It's not easy, Keanu admitted. But nothing worth doing ever is. Elliot sighed, rubbing his hands together. I just don't want to mess it up. You know? I don't want to let people down. I don't want to let you down. Keanu's expression softened. You won't. You don't know that. Yeah, I do, Keanu said. Because I've seen what you've done. And I know the kind of person you are now. That doesn't change overnight. You won't let them down because you won't let yourself down. Elliot swallowed, the weight of those words settling over him. I still don't know where to go from here. Keanu shrugged. Then don't worry about the next 10 steps. Just take the next one. Elliot thought about that for a moment. It was simple advice, but it made sense. He had spent so much of his life worrying about the future, what would happen, what wouldn't happen, how everything could go wrong. Maybe it was time to stop overthinking and just do something. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I can do that. Keanu smiled, leaning back in his chair. Good. They sat there for a while longer, just two guys drinking coffee, talking about life. No cameras, no press, no expectations. Just the kind of honest conversation Elliot had never had before all of this. Eventually, Keanu glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed. I should probably get going. Press stuff, meetings, the usual nonsense. Elliot smirked. Celebrity life keeping you busy? You have no idea. Keanu stood, stretching slightly. But I'm glad we did this. Yeah, me too. Keanu pulled a few bills from his wallet and dropped them on the table. This one's on me. Elliot raised an eyebrow. Dude, you saved my life. I think I owe you more than a coffee. Keanu grinned. Well, you can pay me back by keeping your promise. Elliot hesitated. What promise? Keanu clapped a hand on his shoulder. To make it count? Elliot exhaled, nodding. Yeah, I will. Keanu gave him a final pat on the shoulder before heading toward the door. But just before he stepped outside, he turned back with a smirk. And Elliot? Elliot looked up. Yeah. Keanu grinned. Next time, you buy the coffee. Elliot laughed. Deal. Then, just like that, Keanu Reeves walked out of the cafe and disappeared into the city, leaving Elliot sitting there, feeling a little lighter than he had in a long time. And for the first time, he wasn't scared of the future. He was ready for it. Elliot sat in the cafe for a long time after Keanu left, staring at his coffee as it grew cold. The weight of their conversation lingered in his mind. He had spent years drifting, waiting for something, anything, to give him direction. Now, he had it, yet somehow, the fear still lingered. The fear of failure, the fear of not being enough. But Keanu was right. He couldn't think 10 steps ahead. He had to focus on the next one. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone. His inbox was flooded with emails, opportunities, interviews, invitations to speak at events. People wanted to hear his story, to hear how a homeless man had turned his life around after a chance encounter with one of the biggest movie stars in the world. But Elliot didn't want to be just a story. He wanted to be a force of change. He scrolled through his messages, stopping at one in particular. A nonprofit organization had reached out, asking if he'd be willing to visit one of their shelters in New York. Not as a speaker, not as some inspirational success case, but as a volunteer. They needed someone who had lived through it. Someone who understood. Elliot's thumb hovered over the reply button. This was it. The next step. He tapped the screen. I'd love to help. When do I start? The plane touched down at JFK Airport late in the evening. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the terminal windows as Elliot stepped into the crisp autumn air. New York was different from LA. More chaotic, more relentless. But that wasn't a bad thing. In a way, it reminded him of himself. As he stepped out of the terminal, a car was already waiting for him. A representative from the shelter, a woman named Sandra, holding a sign with his name on it. You're earlier than expected, she said, smiling as she shook his hand. Nervous? Elliot chuckled. A little. Haven't been to New York in years. Well, welcome back, she said, leading him to the car. We really appreciate you coming. Most people just write a check and call it a day. It's rare to have someone who actually wants to be hands-on. Yeah, well, Elliot muttered, running a hand through his hair. I know what it's like to be on the other side of it. Sandra studied him for a moment. That's why you're going to make a difference here. The drive through the city was surreal. Elliot watched the streets blur past, the towering billboards, the neon lights, the constant movement. A year ago, he would have never imagined himself here. Now, he wasn't just passing through. He was here to help. They arrived at the shelter just past midnight. It wasn't a massive facility, just a converted building in the Bronx, a temporary home for people trying to find their footing again. Sandra led him inside, where a few volunteers were still working late into the night, helping people settle into their beds. We've got a packed house tonight, she said, walking him through the main hall. Every bed's full. This time of year, people are just trying to stay warm. Elliot nodded, his throat tightening as he looked around. He recognized the hollow expressions on the faces of the people sitting along the walls. He recognized the exhaustion, the hopelessness, the way some of them clutched their few belongings like they were the only things keeping them tethered to reality. He knew because he had been them. Sandra led him to a small office where another man, mid-40s, salt and pepper beard, sat behind a desk covered in paperwork. James, this is Elliot. He'll be helping out this week. James stood, offering a firm handshake. Good to have you here, man. We need all the help we can get. Elliot nodded. Glad to be here. James gestured toward the room outside. You'll be working directly with our residents. You up for that? Elliot didn't hesitate. Yeah, I am. The first night was humbling. Elliot spent hours talking to people, listening to their stories. Some had been on the streets for years. Some had just lost everything a few months ago. One man, barely in his 30s, sat across from Elliot in the common area, hands shaking as he held a cup of coffee. Lost my job after the pandemic, he muttered. Then my apartment. Then everything. Elliot nodded, his own memories flooding back. Yeah, I know how that goes. The man looked up, studying him. Do you? Elliot smiled wryly. More than you think. For the first time that night, the man relaxed. And Elliot realized, this was what he was meant to do. By the third day, Elliot had fully settled in. He wasn't just volunteering. He was part of the shelter. He spent his time organizing donations, helping people file for housing assistance, teaching basic job interview skills. And every night, after the work was done, he sat down with them and just talked. He listened. Because sometimes, that was the thing people needed most. On his last night there, Sandra pulled him aside. You're good at this, she said. You ever think about doing this full-time? Elliot hesitated. He had been so focused on taking things one step at a time, he hadn't even considered the bigger picture. But now it seemed obvious. Yeah, he said finally. I think I have. Sandra smiled. Good. Because I think you just found your next step. A few weeks later, Elliot returned to LA, but not as the same person. The experience at the shelter had changed him, given him purpose. He met with the board members of the Keanu Foundation and made a proposal. They wouldn't just be an awareness campaign. They would launch their own shelters. Not just places to sleep, but real opportunities for people to rebuild their lives. Keanu, sitting at the head of the table, grinned. Now that's an idea I can get behind. And just like that, a new mission was born. The first shelter under the Keanu Foundation opened 6 months later. Elliot stood at the entrance, watching as the first residents walked in, some hesitantly, others with cautious hope. A woman, clutching the hand of her young daughter, stopped in front of him. Is this really free? She asked. Elliot smiled. Yeah, it is. She nodded slowly, stepping inside, her little girl looking up at him with wide eyes. Elliot exhaled. This was what Keanu had meant when he said to make it count. And now? He was. That evening, Keanu showed up unannounced. Elliot found him standing near the entrance, hands in his pockets, watching the shelter from a distance. You really don't like grand openings, do you? Elliot teased. Keanu smirked. Not my style. Elliot leaned against the wall next to him. But you still showed up. Keanu shrugged. Had to see it for myself. They stood in silence for a moment, watching as people settled in for the night. Keanu finally turned to Elliot. You proud of yourself? Elliot nodded. Yeah, I am. Keanu smiled. Good. Elliot glanced at him. Think this counts? Keanu chuckled. Oh yeah, this counts. They stood there, watching the city, knowing that this was just the beginning. Because sometimes, one act of kindness is all it takes to change the world.